Lately, it seems there isn't a single video game release that doesn't spark controversy within the community for one reason or another. Warhammer 40k, Space Marine 2 has just launched, becoming one of the most spectacular and enjoyable games of the year. Moreover, it represents a title that is a beacon of hope for all fans of the Games Workshop universe, as this sequel was thought to be impossible for years after THQ, the rights holder of the franchise, closed its doors in 2013. The IP was left in limbo until it was acquired by Focus Entertainment, which tasked Saber Interactive with developing the sequel. This studio has proven to be 100% dedicated to the legacy of Relic with the series. Today, Space Marine 2 is a reality and has been released to excellent reviews overall. However, in some analyses, it's surprising to read as a negative point that it is a linear game. This basically means it has no filler and that its progression is guided, meaning we can't get lost in its world. But why should this be considered bad? Why does it detract points from a video game? I bring you a video opinion in which we'll discuss how linear video games are also necessary. Not everything has to be open world in the gaming industry, as sometimes less is better. As I just mentioned, the recent Space Marine 2 has faced criticism from some media with the negative argument that it is a linear game. How is it possible that, in today's world, being linear is viewed as a flaw in development? When it comes to this specific game, Space Marine 2 offers us straightforward gameplay. Progressing forward with our bolter rifle and melee weapon, we eliminate hundreds of Tyranids along the way. There's a background story you can connect with to varying degrees, depending on how much of a fan you are of the Warhammer universe. But the important aspect is the gameplay, which has a distinctive element, providing direct fun without complications. Saber Interactive has opted for an incredibly enjoyable online cooperative mode for both the main campaign and its operations mode, which will expand in the future with updates. It's true that the campaign lasts about 10 hours, and if we're strict, its maps feel like hallways where we go from point A to point B. But why is this bad? Isn't it better to have a game that offers a campaign like this, without any filler, and that you'll want to replay, rather than the same old open world loaded with tasks you don't want to do, artificially extending the experience? Space Marine 2 has emerged as one of the big surprises of the year in terms of quality, and it hasn't needed any artificiality to achieve that. And this is where I wonder, if this path is overwhelmingly fun, why should its rating be tarnished by saying its problem is that it's a linear game when the reality is that this has been the route the developers deemed most appropriate for the experience? What do you think would have happened if Space Marine 2 had been an open-world game? It likely would have been just another game and wouldn't have had its own identity. Unfortunately, many today consider a game that opts for linearity and an established path to be obsolete. Open-world mechanics have dominated the market, and some media and players don't realize that, in some cases, open worlds can lead to losing more than they gain. Who would have thought when we first saw Assassin's Creed that Ubisoft's game would set a trend within the industry? Despite the fact that years earlier, the GTA series had offered us massive worlds, with entries like GTA 3, Vice City, or San Andreas, Rockstar's games remained a kind of unique entity within their genre. However, action and adventure games began to change with the arrival of Altair on consoles and PC, culminating in a transformation with Ezio in Assassin's Creed 2. This game established a standardized open-world pattern that has been used by numerous studios ever since, and Ubisoft has been recycling it for the past 15 years. Most titles that copied this formula end up feeling repetitive, artificially extended, leading to experiences that stretch to 50 hours, of which only 10 or 12 are truly engaging, while the rest contribute little. Many of you are probably thinking of The Witcher 3 as a prime example of an open-world game that does things right, showcasing incredible care for its side content. Red Dead Redemption 2 is another clear example, being one of the best open worlds in gaming history, featuring NPCs that behave coherently, side quests that enhance the story, and an open world that brims with beauty and vitality. The issue is that, aside from a few exceptions, the reality is that many of the open worlds we play could be better if they were linear adventures. How many people have dropped the Assassin's Creed series because they felt they were playing the same game over and over? Ubisoft has turned its own open-world style into an art of recycling. People demand long-lasting games because, with today's video game prices, they want experiences that last. But what's better? 50 hours with many dull moments, or 12 intense hours of pure enjoyment? This brings us back to Space Marine 2. Titus's Odyssey against the Tyranids wouldn't make sense as an open-world game. It's an experience that works perfectly in a linear format. Adding a massive map full of points to explore would simply have turned Space Marine 2 into just another average game. The reality is that each video game has its own identity. Some fit as open world and should be that way, while others need to be linear to avoid getting lost in a sea of irrelevant activities that detract rather than add. I'll quote the argument made by Astrobot director Nicolas Doucet, who said, "It's better to have 12 to 15 hours of condensed fun than a 40-hour game with parts you want to skip." He makes a valid point. Astrobot can take up to 20 hours to reach 100%, but it's 20 hours of pure enjoyment. From this perspective, we can say we've seen plenty of video games that deliver direct fun without any filler, and they do it spectacularly. There are examples of this. How many of you remember Vanquish, the work of Shinji Mikami for Platinum Games? It was pure action that borrowed the cover system from Gears of War, but added its own frenetic twist to spice up the recipe. Shooting, hallway-like maps, and the gameplay structure based on levels like in old games. Did we care? Not at all. Quite the opposite. It's a delightful game that you can finish in 8 hours and will definitely want to replay. Evil West offered a classic approach to gameplay, combining demons with the Wild West in a completely linear adventure, with levels that are essentially hallways where we smash through dozens of enemies, combining melee with firearms. Its story mode gives us about 8 to 10 hours of pure enjoyment. Akimebot is a recent indie game from the creators of Pumpkin Jack, inspired by the platforming and action era of the PS2, with major influences from Ratchet and Clank and Jak and Daxter, which is evident in its gameplay. The game lasts between 6 and 8 hours and has a completely linear progression. Is that bad? No, because it's 6 to 8 hours of pure joy. Guardians of the Galaxy, one of Square's biggest flops in recent years, was also a linear game. It was fantastic, though it suffered collateral damage from the infamous Avengers game, a failed live service title. In Guardians of the Galaxy, you move from point A to point B. It features a narrative that captures the spirit of the comic characters, with collectibles and skins hidden throughout the map. The best part of Guardians of the Galaxy is that it offers 100% of its content without any filler. Another example is Hi-Fi Rush, one of the most surprising games in recent years. This title from Tango Gameworks harkens back to the Dreamcast era, a time when games were more arcade-style, and combines that with sublime gameplay mechanics and artistic flair. Hi-Fi Rush is a level-based adventure, like classic games, filled with secrets, and every few stages, you face a boss. What I mean to say is that being linear isn't a bad thing. Each game should have its own path and identity. Forcing an open world into a game that would work better as a linear experience can ruin it. This is the issue that affects Ubisoft the most, as they've established the same pattern across all their franchises, making many feel like they're playing the same game with different skins. Assassin's Creed, Watch Dogs, and Star Wars Outlaws all follow the clear Ubisoft open world template. They may have a setting you prefer, but within their framework, there's a ton of unnecessary content. Far Cry has become a recycling machine from one installment to the next, especially since the third game, which boosted the series' popularity. The map of Far Cry Primal was exactly the same as that of Far Cry 4, which has been proven. Or the fact that Avatar, Frontiers of Pandora, is essentially a Far Cry game in terms of structure, but dressed in the visuals of James Cameron's film series. What I'm saying is that every game has its own path, and we shouldn't force it into one direction or another just to make it feel longer or larger, because bigger isn't always better. In fact, I can think of some games I've loved, but where I felt the creators focused too much on making them bigger just because they were sequels and had to outdo the previous game. Big mistake. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is incredible, but I have to admit that, content-wise, it's overwhelming. Each open area has an excessive number of tasks, which end up being repetitive across different locations. Not to mention the massive amount of minigames. As I said, I really enjoyed the core experience, but I left many side tasks unfinished because I got tired of the filler. Like a Dragon, Infinite Wealth took us to Miami and had us revisit familiar cities from the franchise. While I loved it, I couldn't shake the feeling of being overwhelmed by the sheer number of things to do. Another example of size getting out of hand. And to be clear, these two games make sense as open worlds, but they could feel too big. As I said, bigger isn't always better. I want to make it clear that I'm not against open world games. What I'm saying is, and I'll repeat, each game should be what it needs to be. Obviously, an adventure that aims to represent a vast journey, like Horizon Forbidden West, must be open world. You can't have an endless hallway in a game that requires you to travel across the world, interact with all the tribes inhabiting it, and help each tribe fend off machine attacks. It's impossible for that to be linear. Black Myth Wukong is a game that prioritizes the feel of combat, which is simply spectacular. Its creators wanted the focus of the gameplay to be combat, so 90% of the game unfolds linearly. And returning to Space Marine 2, we have a game where action and shooting take precedence. It's pure brutality, a game where, as we move through each level, we feel like we're systematically cleaning up the Tyranids, constantly reducing their numbers. Would it have been better as an open-world game filled with side quests, where Tyranids respawn constantly, and we have to grind levels because enemies also level up? Honestly, I don't think so. Space Marine 2 gets straight to the point with no filler, making everything it offers fun. So if it lasts 10 hours, you know you'll have such a good time that you'll want to come back. The conclusion is basically that we need to let video games be what they are meant to be. Not everything can be linear, and not everything can be open world. What we need to understand is that being linear isn't bad. In fact, if we think about it, before the Assassin's Creed craze and the Ubisoft pattern, 90% of the games on the market were linear, and we never cared. This wasn't inherently good or bad. It was just an intrinsic characteristic of those games, like any other. That's why, folks, I believe that if the only criticism someone has for a game like Space Marine 2 is that it's linear, two things happen. One, they either haven't found any significant flaws and are just using that to fill space in their review and dock points. Or two, they may have a strong preference for open-world games that is overly reflected in their reviews. And that's fine, everyone has their tastes, but not everything can be open world, just as not everything can be linear. Now tell me, what do you prefer, open world or linear games? Do you agree with my opinion, or do you have another point of view? I read you in the comments.